new to a lot of faces. I don't see anyone familiar except maybe through Twitter, which I was also very new to a few weeks ago when I joined. So it's great to see such a big, vibrant community doing stuff, even though we're all locked up in our houses / apartments.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this week I chose a paper looking at how biodiversity increases ecosystem functions despite multiple stressors on coral reefs, done by Dr. Casey Benkwit, who is a senior research associate at Lancaster University, a part of Reefs, a group of natural and social scientists who are looking at solutions for equitable governance of coral reefs so that there's a long-term future for both the communities that are dependent on them as well as the ecosystems themselves. So glad you could join us, Casey. It's a very cool paper, and I thought it would be very interesting to talk about. The main reason I thought it would be really cool, especially for this group, is because this is a paper, and I haven't seen a huge amount of them, that actually looks at how seabirds affect their environment rather than, the huge amount of telemetry studies that are out that allow us to look at how the environment might affect seabirds and their distribution. And I thought this was a very kind of thought-provoking thing, because as we're finding seabird distributions and ranges are starting to be affected by climate change, it should also be important to think about, as they're shifting in their ranges, how they might affect those environments that they're around. And so, yeah, I thought this would be a really cool paper to look at. So I'll give a kind of brief overview of everything, and then I guess we can get started in the questions. So for this paper, they're looking at coral reefs out at the Chagos Islands. Tropical systems are some of the most diverse on the planet, and they're also some of the most threatened by climate change and other sort of human-caused disturbances. And so very important to study these systems. They've seen a lot of how humans are affecting these coral reef systems, but as the paper has mentioned, there's very little understanding of how these kind of human-caused disturbances might affect the relationship between the ecosystem functions and biodiversity in these areas. And so they wanted to address two main questions looking at these for these studies: is how do bleaching events affect the relationship between biodiversity ecosystem functions, and then how might seabird poop affect the relationship between these ecosystem functions, which I thought was really cool. You can learn a lot from poop. Having been someone who's looked through poop before for seabirds, definitely caught my attention. So the kind of two questions: do climate extremes and or invasives affect these ecosystem relationship functions? And what are sort of the direct and indirect pathways that these human-caused disturbances affect these ecosystem functions? And so they use fish biomass and productivity as measures to examine these two things, being those being good proxies for kind of overall productivity of a system. And so going into the results, they had to address the first question, which is, what are the relationships between biodiversity and ecosystem functions? Because that hadn't been established. Theirs was the first study actually looking at this on remote coral reefs. And so they found that there is, in fact, a positive relationship between biodiversity and these ecosystem functions, and that biodiversity had the largest effect on these ecosystem functions when compared to other predictors such as invasive rats, climate extreme events, or coral structural complexity of the coral reefs. And so the results showed that for every 10% increase in biodiversity, you have about a 16% increase in biomass of fish and a 17% increase in the productivity of the fish out there, suggesting that biomass is really important for these functions. Something about biodiversity really kind of helps these fish thrive in these ecosystems. And so another kind of interesting thing they found for this kind of smaller scale study that they did at these reefs is that the slope for biomass is very comparable to that of a global analysis of reef systems, suggesting that these the relationship between biodiversity and these ecosystem functions isn't necessarily scale dependent. So it's pretty consistent between larger scales and smaller scales, which in this field where everything tends to be kind of scale depending on the analysis you look at, it's like a pretty cool result to see that, you know, this biodiversity is important across all these large scales. And so the next thing they did was they looked at human caused stressors and how they affected the relationship of these ecosystem functions. And so they looked at climate extremes and invasives, and they found that both of those had minor effects on the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem function, suggesting that these relationships are resilient. And even with both stressors present, the relationship was still positive. So biodiversity still increases biomass and productivity, even under an extremely stressed system. But they found that the biodiversity and biomass slope was steeper on islands with rats, suggesting that those islands tend to have lower biodiversity with more rats present, or lower biomass and biodiversity. And then also that productivity was steeper on islands that were after the climate extreme. And so something about the climate extreme affects the productivity of the fish, and rats affect the biomass of the fish. So looking at the biomass, there is a marginal difference between the biodiversity biomass relationship slope on rat and rat-free islands. And this was kind of offset by the fact that some of these rat-free islands had lower biodiversity, but they had a larger standing stock of biomass, suggesting that seabird poop is an important nutrient input for these systems, and that it can offset the lack of diversity that might be present at some of these systems, possibly either naturally or kind of from human-induced events. And this was contrasted with their findings that there was no evidence suggesting that climate extreme events affected the biodiversity biomass relationship at these islands. And then looking at productivity, there's kind of an opposite effect of that from the biomass, in that they could not conclude that islands with rats present had effect on the productivity slope compared to rat-free islands, but they found that the heat wave bleaching event caused an increase in the slope marginally. And so this kind of supports the conclusion that biodiversity is a very important buffer for these extreme events, because increased diversity means a lot more functional redundancy in terms of the sort of ecosystem functions and roles that certain species play. And so more diverse environments tend to do better after these events, because even though some species are lost, they still have other ones that serve a similar function and can still maintain those functions in the ecosystem. And so they suggest that biomass is possibly not affected by the heat wave, because smaller species tend to decrease in abundance after these heat waves compared to larger species. And while these species might affect productivity, the smaller ones don't have as large a standing stock as these larger species, which is why they don't see the dip. But over longer time scales, they suggest that there's still degradation that occurs, even if you don't see it in the short term, 2 to 4 years after, like they found in their studies. And so on the long term, these climate events can still affect both diversity and the ecosystem functions on these islands, and that these effects can be cumulative over time. So the more heat waves that occur at these coral reefs, kind of the larger the effect each time on both diversity and these ecosystem functions. And so then they wanted to look into the effects of the stressors via direct and diversity mediated pathways. And so their results suggest that the heat wave has a small positive effect on the ecosystem function slope in the short term, which would seem counterintuitive because heat waves affect the corals negatively. And so you'd think that things would be worse, but it suggested that larger species, especially herbivores such as parrotfish present in the system, tend to kind of benefit from an increase in food availability shortly after these heat wave events. But biodiversity will eventually decrease. It has a negative effect, decreasing by 17% 2 to 4 years after the event. So you see a short-term increase in the parrotfish and the biomass, but then as time goes on after this event, the overall productivity of the system, and biodiversity just decreases from these negative effects. And so it's kind of a vicious loop with this, in that biodiversity is important for maintaining ecosystem functions, and it helps buffer against these climate events, but these climate events themselves negatively affect biodiversity. And so you're trying to maintain biodiversity, but climate change and these extreme heat events keep decreasing it. And so, yeah, it just seems like a pretty big challenge to try and overcome. And then looking at the next thing related to this group, rats and their effects on seabirds and how that might affect these systems. Rats decrease biodiversity by decreasing guano, which is a nutrient input for the coral reef. So it decreases nitrogen input into the system. But these kind of indirect effects that rats have on biodiversity are 50% less severe than that of climate change, or the climate extremes. But the thing is that rats consistently have negative effects on all of these ecosystem functions that they measured in the systems compared to the climate extreme events. And so loss of nutrients equals a loss in biomass, which eventually will lead to a loss of productivity and can affect the biodiversity. And then they've run some models just looking at kind of different scenarios in terms of how seabird guano input might affect productivity around islands. And even in the most conservative one, they found that guano did affect the productivity around the islands, suggesting that it is a very kind of important input for these islands out in this system in terms of helping to buffer it against climate change and these heat wave events with all the nutrient input. And so, you know, seabird poop is very important out there. It's a good thing. And so just kind of in conclusion for this paper, biodiversity is a very important thing for these systems. They found, you know, this relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functions in a lot of different systems. And so it's important for management to try to preserve biodiversity, to preserve ecosystem functions within all of these systems. Yeah, so that's my kind of overview, and I'll ask a couple of questions to Casey, and then I'll turn it over to other people to ask. And so my first question, I'm not very familiar with tropical systems, and I know this research looking into seabird inputs into corals is actually very new. You know, your guys' study was the first looking at these systems. So I wanted to know what in the literature, what in the results you guys have seen kind of before this suggested that, you know, this guano input might be an important source for coral reefs.
Yeah, good question. And thanks for the really, really good overview of the paper as well. I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, so there's been more work starting looking at the importance of these natural nutrients, especially seabird guano, and also some work on fish poop, which has been happening since the 80s or so, and how that influences coral reefs. So there's been some papers looking at corals specifically, and it seems like really the important thing is that guano has a ideal ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. And so in contrast to like human caused nutrients like agricultural runoff and sewage, which can be detrimental for reefs, the natural nutrients with these ideal ratios can actually help coral growth, help them maybe buffer against the effects of climate change, and then also help fish grow and fish reach bigger sizes as they're feeding on this algae and coral that's been enriched by the nutrients. Yeah, and in terms of thinking up the project, my postdoc advisor did a paper a few years ago where they basically were out in these islands with some seabird researchers and coral reef researchers and just thought, wow, there's this huge difference in seabirds on the islands. It's so noticeable when you're above water, but people hadn't really started looking at what that means underwater, especially on coral reefs. So they thought, let's figure it out.
Wow, very cool. That's interesting they came across that. So my next question, because I know you are doing work trying to get rid of invasive rats on these islands to restore the seabird populations. So in terms of the guano input, because on these islands I saw there are 17 species of seabird that breed out there, but there seem to be a handful that contribute to most of the population of the seabirds out there. And so when you're trying to restore these islands and you're thinking about attraction of different seabird species, is it important to have a kind of diverse array of seabird species for the guano input, or is it purely the amount of guano that's put into the system regardless of the species?
Yeah, that's another really good question that we are actually just thinking about yesterday. So I just got back some analysis of the nitrogen signatures of guano from some different species of seabirds, and there does appear to be some differences in it, probably because, as I'm sure this group knows a lot better than I do, seabirds feed on different species out in the ocean, right? And so it's really what they're feeding on that's affecting their nutrient inputs. So as far as I know, no one, and at least our group, hasn't yet looked into how the diversity or how the different species of seabirds affects what's going on in the reefs, but it's definitely something we started thinking about, and it would be really, really interesting to follow up on that.
Okay, and then it's kind of one more question, kind of on the tail of that. So looking at this, you looked at how this heat event affected the ecosystem functions in these coral reefs. You looked at how rats kind of indirectly affected by directly affecting seabirds and their nutrient input into these coral reefs. As you guys are trying to restore these islands and you're bringing the seabirds back, rats will be kind of taken out of the equation, hopefully, but climate change is still going to be present. And so it seems like there's a big area of study looking at how climate change will indirectly affect the coral reefs by directly affecting the seabirds. And so I was just curious if you had any, since we're all a bunch of seabird researchers and some of us might be looking for more research questions in the future, are there any studies of seabirds that you think might be important to help kind of address some of these questions for these coral reef systems?
Yeah, one thing that I've seen, I forget what paper where I saw it, but I believe there's been some studies on how climate change might be affecting ocean productivity, which would then feed back to the seabirds and then feed back to the reefs. And so, yeah, most of our focus about climate change has obviously been on warming waters and their effects on coral specifically, leading to coral bleaching and coral death. But yeah, the feedback loops between then how climate change is affecting the seabirds would be really, really interesting to know. And I think one way could be their foraging success could influence how much guano they're actually bringing back and their population sizes, which could then influence the inputs to the reefs. And then I know, I think some groups are starting to look at this. So there's other groups that are kind of taking care of the rat eradication in the seabird work, because I'm more of a coral reef ecologist, but it sounds like there's still a lot of questions about, once you remove rats, how long it takes for seabirds to come back and kind of what you can do to help facilitate that process and where they come from when they recolonize. And there's a lot of work to be done.
Definitely. All right, that's all my questions for now.
Cool. All right. Thanks for that, Sean. Joe, I see your hand there, and let me just, David, if you have a question first. If not, I'll pop over to Joanna.
Maybe a quick one. You suggested that the different seabird species may have a different impact on productivity through their diets. So in that case, what do the analysis show, that the piscivorous species have a higher impact than others, for instance?
Yeah, so far we haven't done any analysis to that level. We've broken down the seabirds by groups, but overall, pretty much all of the different groups are higher on the rat-free islands to varying degrees. And so, yeah, so far we've been just doing kind of categorical, do they have rats versus do they have no rats and lots of seabirds. Part of why we haven't broken it down further is, at least for a lot of these islands, they're pretty hard to get to. And so the groups doing work on Seabird can get there, you know, maybe once a year if they're lucky, sometimes twice a year. And so there's not always the best data on exact population sizes for the different groups. But yeah, it'd be something that it would be interesting to look at. We just haven't done that level of detail yet.
Okay, yeah, really great study. Thanks.
Thanks.
Cool. All right, Joanna, I'll unmute you. There you go. You're unmuted. Go for it.
Okay, this was a really interesting study, and I've been sort of interested in poop off and on for years. And in the late 1970s, when I was working on Franklin skulls in inland areas, I looked at poop and the distribution of nutrients as a function of distance away from where the birds were actually nesting. So I'm wondering, A, if you've done that, and B, it seems to me that it would therefore have an effect on the fish and coral reefs that are different distances from the Seabird Islands, because coral reefs are not all at the same distance from a given colony of birds. And have you looked at that? Because spatial distance and poop quantity could be an important factor in how the system is operating.
Yeah, great question. And we have been thinking about that. So again, it didn't come up in this paper, but we have done some other sampling, testing, like collecting algae and fish from the same islands at different distances to shore, and you definitely do see a decrease in the signature, the same thing as you're describing in aquatic systems. And I think there's been some other studies on land as well at different distances from seabird colonies. So as you move offshore, the nitrogen guano signal definitely does decrease around these seabird islands. Right now it looks like there's a pretty strong signal definitely within 200 to 400 meters from shore, maybe a little bit further, but then it decreases. And we've been thinking about it as well. A lot of our work has been on lagoonal sides of islands, so they're a little bit more enclosed lagoons, less wave action, calmer. And as the first step, we've been doing most of our work really close to shore on these lagoonal reefs, first to establish, is there any signal? And now we're moving to move further offshore and also look at lagoon side as well as more of the exposed side to see what wave action and things like that do to influence the spatial extent of the guano effects.
So is there a higher fish diversity around reefs as a function of distance from islands generally?
Yeah, so we didn't do the diversity surveys at different distances. So they were all done within 200 to 300 meters from shore. And that's what we have right now. We have some surveys from the outside of islands that we want to compare to the lagoonal sides, but we haven't gotten to that yet.
Very nice study, thank you.
Thanks for your questions.
Thanks, Joe. All right, we got a question from Jonathan Green. John, hang on. There you go. You are hopefully unmuted. There you go.
Thanks, Grant. And thank you for this. A cool study, Casey. Sorry, I must confess I didn't get a chance to read the paper myself this week. So thanks to Sean for a really cool summary of that for me. I was wondering whether there's any studies or evidence for similar effects in temperate regions or polar regions, biodiverse areas, maybe kelp forests, or is there kind of is there no nutrient limitation there, so it's not such a big deal?
Yeah, good question. So I have seen one study for rocky intertidal areas, so not subtidal, but intertidal, showing some differences of seabird guano on community structure. I think that was one of Wooten's papers from the 90s, if I recall correctly. I don't know of any in temperate regions looking at kelp forests, and my thoughts are pretty much exactly what you said. So coral reefs are really nutrient limited, being in the tropics, super oligotrophic waters. So I think that there's probably a much bigger effect of nutrients there, whereas kelp forests and temperate reefs are usually in upwelling areas that get a lot of oceanographic nutrients more directly anyway. So I don't think seabird guano would have as much of effect there, but I also don't know of any papers looking at it off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's quite interesting. I remember spending a season with Project Puffin and those tern islands, and you look at the neighboring islands don't have any birds nesting on them, you can see the difference in the vegetation. And I mean, obviously, the next logical step to that is if they're fertilizing the terrestrial environment like that, what are the coastal regions like? There was a paper in 2012 in Scientific Reports, I believe, by Douglas Macaulay, that links seabird this is the one from Palmyra Atoll, which looks at linking seabird nutrients to manta ray, and how the nutrients are potentially acting as an attractant to manta ray populations, which I thought was quite cool. I think that's and I think there's some interesting things to look at regarding some of these really intense seabird colonies. You know, some of the really densely populated ones, like in South Georgia and the Aleutian Islands, where we have a lot of runoff, a lot of rain, and highly productive ecosystems. And I'm wondering if you've had any indication from your work as to what, say, the total contribution of seabirds might be in comparison to things like whales or fish, for example. In this case, are seabirds really driving that productivity, or is it something else?
Good question. So I haven't looked at that specifically, so this is kind of my gut feeling about it. I think in areas, as you said, in areas where there are tons of seabirds, and the Chagos Archipelago is one of those areas where the rat-free islands have tons of seabirds, I think they're playing quite a big role. And again, as you said, there's all that classic work, especially by Gary Polis and others, about the effects of seabirds on islands. And I mean, it's a huge difference. So it makes sense that it's translating into the ocean as well. But yeah, in terms of their relative contribution, it would probably just depend on how many seabirds there are and what the other oceanographic forces are, like internal waves and upwelling, what's going on with that. But yeah, one thing I am interested in thinking about is whether there's some sort of feedback loop. So if we've shown that seabirds increase biomass, and then we know from other groups' works that fish biomass, when you have more fish, they're also contributing more nutrients to the reefs. So there might be kind of this feedback, whereas you have more seabirds, you have more fish, and if you have more fish, you have more nutrients. And kind of the interplay and the relative contributions would be really interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually makes me wonder a bit to some of these studies on olfaction in seabirds. You know, these procellariforms, for example, that can smell dimethyl sulfide, which is a product of release from phytoplankton and zooplankton that are being eaten. As to whether or not there's you know, if they're pooping in the water, are they attracting themselves back to that same place where they pooped, you know? And what I'm curious, is there, are you aware of any studies or any work that's been done around whether or not the productivity around these coral reefs, like, is there any evidence, I should say, that they're being attracted to this by something other than the innate knowledge that there's a coral reef in an area? Is there any evidence of birds or marine mammals being attracted to it for other reasons other than that innate knowledge?
So I can't speak to birds and marine mammals so much. I can speak to fish a bit, and there's definitely quite a few studies about fish. So they have a larval phase where they're out in the open ocean, usually for about a month or so, and then they come and they settle to the reefs. And there's been quite a bit of work about how olfactory cues affects where they choose to settle. So things like live coral, lack of algae, lack of predators. What else is there? I think there's one study that found terrestrial leaves helps fish find islands. So I wouldn't be surprised if fish, at least, and potentially, yeah, as you said, seabirds and other animals are using olfactory cues to get more attracted to those seabird islands.
Yeah, cool. That's a really interesting discussion. I'm really into seabird poop for a whole number of reasons, aside from the fact that I love being covered in seabird poop, because that typically means that I'm on a seabird island. I don't get the opportunity to be covered in it when I'm not out in the field.
Yeah, I have to say I didn't expect I'd be studying seabird poop, but here I am, and it is really cool. So
Here you are. I think that's it. Once you start getting into seabird poop, it gets too cool at that point, and you get to become one of the elite few. All right. Do we have any more questions from anyone in the audience? Oh, sorry, David has gotten muted for some reason. Hang on. There you go, David. You're unmuted.
No, that's fine.
Okay. Did you have any more questions, David, or are you okay?
No, I found this really interesting, and I think you covered it really well. Yeah, maybe just a quick one, but you answered it already partly. The rats themselves, and their droppings, they can't have a positive effect on the coastal ecosystems through the runoff.
Yeah, so I think the difference between the rat poop and the seabird poop is that because seabirds are feeding out in the open ocean, they're feeding quite high on the food chain and bringing back kind of those pelagic nutrients. They're subsidizing the ecosystem, whereas the rats are just feeding on what's already on the islands. And so they're not, I don't think they're providing the nitrogen and phosphorus in that same critical ratio that the seabirds are. So they're likely not benefiting the reefs in the same way.
Yeah, there's probably an order of magnitude in the amount of stuff they can pump into the system.
Yeah.
Cool. And Sean, do you have any more follow-ups before we move on to the next paper? Oh, sorry, you go.
No, there are a lot of good questions, and I think Casey did a really good job of answering everything.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us, Casey. And Sean, thanks for that really thorough and awesome introduction to that paper. So,
Yep.
All right, with that, I think we'll move on to the next paper, and David will be presenting.